Okay, hello and welcome to the next episode of the Speed Mooting podcast. My name is John Dove and I am the host of the podcast. Tonight we've got another very special guest. Our guest tonight has been a panelist on many of our Q&A sessions during the pandemic and has also judged at many of our competitions over the past few years. So it brings me great pleasure to say that we've got Rebecca Reeves on the podcast. Welcome along.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for coming along. So we'll start with a really basic one. Would you like to sort of introduce yourself, say what you do and the type of work that you do?
Yes, I'm a civil barrister. I have a relatively general practice, but particularly specialising in property law. I practice out of Cornwall Street Barristers in Birmingham, and I sit as a deputy district judge.
Interesting. Well, really good mix there. So we'll break that down slightly then. So you've talked about the sort of the practice itself as a barrister, and you've talked about the property work. Would you like to give us a flavour of the sort of work that you deal with?
Property work can vary greatly. So you can be working on someone who's in mortgage or rent arrears, something like that. There can be bigger commercial disputes, but what the area that really grabs me is Talata work. So that's often where two or more people or entities own a property, and they disagree about how that property is then going to be divided. Mostly it's used where couples who are unmarried separate, and they might say, oh, actually, we had a conversation 25 years ago and we said that although the deeds say it's joint, actually I was going to have 70% and they were going to have 30%, and you get into all of that. It also occurs quite a lot in the areas that I practice in between siblings who have bought into each other's properties, and then there's usually some sort of fallout, and you've got to try and wheedle down who owns what percentage of which property. One of the reasons I like it the most, other than the fact it's just a very interesting area of law, is the cross-examination, which is my favourite part. And because it's almost always oral conversations that have happened years ago, you can get some really, really juicy cross-examination out of it. And that's why it's one of my preferred areas.
Wow, I can imagine that does sound quite fun, actually. And of course, you say that you sit as a deputy DJ as well. How often do you do that?
Well, at the moment, not very often because my practice is so busy and I'm trying to keep on top of that. But when I was appointed during the pandemic, so yay. So April 2020, I was appointed.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And then the training all got thrown out the window because it's a week-long residential course. So you obviously can't do that. There were various attempts to set it up remotely, and eventually we managed to get it that they extended it to 7 working days, and you did it remotely, which is hard work.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot anyway. They're intense courses as it is, and part of the joy of those things is the dinner in the evening. And what you're doing is doing this whole day of intensive training and then turning your computer off and sitting by yourself. I mean, I was going to watch a Marvel film because I used it to go through all of the Marvels from the beginning.
Yeah.
So that was kind of, my week. And then you have to shadow full-time judges before you're allowed to sit yourself.
Right.
And they changed the rules around that a little bit because of the issues with training. So you started to do your 5 days, but before the pandemic, it was strict that you had to do X number of days before your training and then X number of days after. But they let us just get trained, and then when we could get in and sit. I then, over the summer of 2021, had quite a drastic change in circumstances, and I moved off circuit to help with some caring responsibilities for my family. And in doing that, I found sitting as a judge extraordinarily helpful, because if nothing else, life at the bar is unpredictable. And when you're trying to care for teenagers or, relatives who need assistance, that unpredictable nature is not very helpful. So from September to January, February, I spoke to Chambers and I said, I'm not going to court as a barrister, I'm just going to sit. And although I live off circuit, only just off circuit.
Mhm.
And because as a deputy you can pick where you sit, I picked the court that was just inside the circuit. So I could preparing things in the morning, go to court, do it, come back, and not have all these things that had to then be done in the evening.
Sure.
So I did a sort of 6-month stint of sitting 3 or 4 days a week.
Okay.
And of course you're employed, so you actually get paid as opposed to being a barrister. So that was
All
also
benefits.
really nice. Yeah. But I try and do, ideally I would do 1 week a month. That would be my preference.
Right.
But I haven't sat since January at the moment, just because of how busy the practice is.
Yeah. Well, it's always a good sign if you're that busy.
Yeah. So it's a very long answer to a question that
No,
didn't
no,
really
it's
need.
okay. So we'll take it a step further back then. Would you like to share with us your route to the bar then?
I will. I actually do a 2-hour talk on my route to the bar, so I'll keep it as brief as possible. I did a non-law degree. I then converted on the GDL, which I think they've made it now more bite-sized. I say it that way. When I did it, you did all of the eight modules at once, and then in June you did 8 3-hour exams in 10 days.
Mhm.
And it's not a productive way of doing it, because you just get burnt out.
Yeah.
No one's going to perform their best, and in fact people just stop turning up because they just couldn't cope. Then I did the bar vocational course, which somewhat gives away my age. And then I didn't get pupillage, essentially. Long story short, I didn't get pupillage. I had 1 interview, which I screwed up. And I got a 2-2 on my undergrad for reasons I won't go into. And I knew it was going to be really difficult. So I did a master's whilst I was working, and I got a distinction in that, thinking that that would overcome the issue of the 2-2. Didn't. So I decided to try and find a different way. And long story short, I ended up getting a full exemption from pupillage. Now, as soon as I say that, my LinkedIn message box goes mad.
Yeah.
And everyone's going, how do you do that? How do you do that? So a really important point is, it isn't easier. I just knew I wasn't going to get a pupillage, so I wanted to be a barrister. So I found a different way of doing it. And actually, what that meant was, when I started at the bar at Cornwall Street in 2018, I had 8 years of different type of legal experience. I worked in the law the whole time, self-employed agent, in-house advocate, case handler in a solicitor's firm. I could hit the ground running. And then when the next DDJ applications came up, although you are supposed to, that everyone thinks the rule is you have to have been in practice for 5 years. I was in practice for 9 months when I applied, because if you had a full exemption from pupillage, they start the clock from when you were called to the bar, not when you got your first practicing certificate.
Right.
So I actually had 8 years under my belt for the purpose of the JAC regulations. But it was a case of sitting down and going through the regulations and figuring it out, to the extent that in my interview, which is I think the 5th stage of the application process, I got asked, are you eligible to apply? At which point I go, yes, I am, I promise. I've taken screenshots in case the website changed.
Let me present my skeleton arguments on this.
It was very much like that. And I think I wasn't expecting to get it. And I think that is part of the reason I did get it, because I was relaxed.
Yeah, exactly.
I went into it thinking, well, if I go through the process, get as far as I can, I've had a practice run. And then when I apply again, I've got an idea of what's happening, because you have tests and all of that sort of thing. Yeah. And I think just because I was a bit more relaxed with it, it just went a lot better.
Definitely. It's funny you should say that. Somebody asked me a similar question the other day, how do you get over nerves in an interview? And I think that's the reality of it. It's, you put so much pressure on yourself when you go into an interview, because you think this is the last one, I've got to get this one or else, particularly if you're applying for training contracts or pupillages or whatever. But the way to think about it is, if you're good enough to get an interview, there should be another one that you're going to be good enough to get. You're going to build up more experience as time goes. So there's always going to be another interview down the road. So of course, go in, prepare for it properly, but don't go in with the attitude of it's do or die, this is the only one, because that puts so much unnecessary pressure on you. So I think if you take a step back and say, well, do you know what? I'm going to go in, put my best foot forward. If I don't get it, so what? There'll be something else that comes up. It makes you a lot more relaxed, I think.
One of the things that people who follow me on LinkedIn or have been to my talks will know is this. The thing that annoys me so much is the pressure that is put on young people, that you have to know what you want to do when you're 16, and you have to have it all planned out, and there's only one way of achieving anything, and all of that is wrong. There are plenty of people at the bar where it's their second or third career. There are alternative ways to get there, as you know, as I went through, and I know some of the other guests you've had on have done. And we put so much weight on what people who are in the profession we want to be in say, and actually they only have their own experience. So they're not necessarily wrong about what they're saying, but it's in the scope of what they know. And I came out of bar school and I didn't think there was any way of becoming a barrister without pupillage. It was pupillage or nothing.
Yeah.
And that's not right, which is why I try and advocate so much for the alternative routes, not because I think it's better or easier necessarily. There are advantages and disadvantages as of anything, but because it's important that people have the information.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I completely agree there. So stemming from the same issue then, or the same topic, I should say, do you have any tips for aspiring barristers then? So tips for sort of pupillage applications or the interview itself?
The first tip I give everyone, which is linked to what I was just saying, is don't let anyone else tell you you're not going to make it. Not everyone can make it. I'm not one of these that think, well, if you want it enough, you'll get it. You have to have the right attributes. You have to have the skills or be able to develop those things. But only you know if that applies to you, and if you do have the skills to do it. And there are so many different areas of law, even if you're deciding between barrister, solicitor, fellow of Silex, which I've done all of those things, whatever route you're going down, or something completely different. Within each of those, there's then all these different areas that have different requirements for your strengths and your weaknesses. You know, a tax barrister does something very different to a chancery barrister. That, you know, tax and chancery are linked together. But someone who focuses entirely on tax and someone who does equity, probate, etc., will have very, very different practices, and therefore your strengths will be different. So if you speak to one of the barristers who do one practice area and they say, well, if you're not good at X, you might as well not bother, which I know some barristers do, and give advice to that extent. You know, if you've got a 2-2, don't bother. If you've come from whatever background, don't bother. That's linked to their prejudices, not your ability. And it's very, very important to remember that. When I was 17, a relatively important person in my life, who now isn't, said I was sitting doing my spreadsheet for how to become a barrister and putting in my dates when I had to apply for everything. And she said, I don't know why you bother, people like you don't become barristers.
Wow.
And in the solicitors firm I worked in, one of the solicitors firm, which I won't name, one of the partners came down from his office to my cubbyhole. I'll call it an office, it wasn't. And in front of everyone, slammed down the files as hard as he could, really, to make sure everyone was listening. And this was my file review. He'd taken my files to do my file review. So this was my feedback. Slammed them down and just went, you will never be a success as a lawyer, and walked off. And when I went and confronted him about it a couple of days later, because obviously I'd been quite upset about it, and I said that was not a very nice thing to say. It's not helpful. If I've done something wrong, tell me what I've done wrong and I can work on it. But to say I'm not going to be a success as a lawyer is not helpful. It's not productive. It's not mentoring. And he just looked up and he said, well, you won't. So, and that was it. At that point, I already knew I was going to have an exemption from pupillage. But if I hadn't, and if I had more respect for him and his opinion, then I might never have done it.
Yeah.
And he was right. I was a terrible solicitor. I was really bad. It did not suit me at all. It doesn't suit my personality. It's a really hard job. And having done it, actually, it really helps in my relationship with solicitors as a barrister, because they know that I understand. And the same with fellows of Silex, because they're so often underappreciated and underestimated, but I know what you have to do to get there. So that works really well as well. So that's my first thing that I always say to everyone: you assess if you can do it, and you make that decision. In respect of more technical advice, which I suspect is more what your question was about, written applications is your written advocacy. That's your example of your written advocacy. Certainly at our chambers, and I suspect at most chambers, you get significant marking for persuasiveness of what you've written. So think very carefully about it. Don't just regurgitate, I've done A, B, and C. Everything should tell us what you learned from it. Saying you've done 15 mini pupilages, but only saying what you saw in court will get you the same number of marks. If you say I did 1 or 2 mini pupilages and saw X, Y, and Z in court, what we want to know is what you learned, that it made a difference, that you're going to be a better barrister because of it. Don't do it parrot fashion throughout. Don't every time you write something say, and I learned, but make it clear that the things that you've done have developed you. Spell check it. And grammar. Get people to read it who aren't lawyers. Doesn't have to be your friends from law school or your mentor. Get them to read it as well. Because often the best advocacy is that can persuade people who don't know anything about what you're talking about. So get everyone to read it, to see if it's comprehensive, to see if it's clear and persuasive. Think very carefully about what you include. Make sure you get the name of the chambers right, because that's not infrequent, that people have copy and pasted things and not changed it. We're all going to have standardized paragraphs that we copy and paste, that's fine, but you have to make sure you've got the right chambers. Spell pupillage correctly, I've had that. So there's all of these different things that need attention to detail, basically, the form. For the interviews, be yourself. That's coming from someone who would never have been herself in a pupillage interview, ever, because I lacked confidence. And actually the interview that I had went really, really, really well. It was going so well. And then they said, we've got people with similar experience to you, why should we pick you? And I said, nothing. I just couldn't answer it because I didn't have the confidence. And I think one of your other guests, I think Jack, said something about going into an interview and treating it like you're your own client.
Yes.
And I really like that.
Yeah.
I really like that, because I can advocate for other people much better than I can advocate for myself. So I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah. We
all know that we would have all taken pupillage on the moon. Doesn't matter where. You all say, oh yeah, I'm absolutely dedicated to living here for the rest of my life. we all know that. And that's the nature of it. Chambers will be more likely to take you if you are more likely to stick around, because they're investing in you. So have a think about that. But also, chambers isn't just a place of work, it's a home. And it's not like other jobs where you move around. It is more common now for people to change chambers, but largely people stay with chambers for their whole career. You don't want to be in one where you don't fit. So trying to be what you think they want isn't actually going to be good for you in the long run. And it can lead to a negative experience in pupillage. And I've seen people do it. I've seen people do pupillage at a set that they weren't a good fit. And at the end, they consider giving up the bar. And it's like, no, just move to somewhere that is a good fit. So bear that in mind about being yourself. And particularly, I mean, I can only really speak for Cornwall Street, but we want to see your personality. If someone comes in, answers the questions, even if they're academically brilliant, and they leave, yeah, not really, probably not for us, because we like doing the crossword around the table at lunchtime and going out on a Friday. And it's all a bit different now post-pandemic, but that's still the sort of atmosphere that we want. So all of those things are really important. Advice for interviews that also crosses over to mooting is be a duck. I used to say be a swan, but I think it's overly ambitious. So just be a duck. Look calm and collected and elegant, even if underneath your feet are going mad and you're panicking, because that's what you have to do in court. So if you can do that in the interview, then we know you can do it in court. I think those are my sort of
that was brilliant. Nice there. Yeah, no, absolutely brilliant. And I think there was a lot of practical advice in there as well. I mean, think particularly about thinking about the chambers, because quite often I think a lot of people go into it with, well, will they accept me? It's a two-way street. You know, you've got to, you know, whatever job you're going in for, you've got to make sure that the place that you're applying to is somewhere you want to be as well. And if you're not going to fit, if it's the wrong, you know, the wrong atmosphere, the wrong area of law, you're not going to enjoy it. And as you say, you know, there's people that might not stick around. So yeah, brilliant advice there.
Yeah, and what's really important is doing the research before you apply. One of the many mistakes I made was applying to too many, fewer excellent applications.
Yes.
And make sure that those are sets that you would want to be a part of and that you are likely to get an interview for. Have a look at their website. Who have they taken on in the last 5 years? If they only take people from Oxbridge and you didn't go to Oxbridge, well, they're losing out because there are so many good candidates who didn't go to Oxbridge, but you're probably not going to get in because that's the ethos and that's their methodology. So don't waste the time on their application. Spend that time doing another application to a better standard. And I think that's really important. And I don't think that's sort of hammered home a lot. I mean, back when I was doing them, I hand wrote every covering letter on parchment with a fountain pen because I was told, you know, the old school kind of sets that I wanted to be in would really appreciate that. So that's how I did it. And I spent hours doing that with a line guide underneath it and things. Wow. And I probably missed out on a lot of points in the body of the applications because I probably did 30 applications a year for 5 years, something like that. And it was too many. I should have done 5, 10. Because you only need one.
Yeah, so it's things you learn through experience, isn't it? Obviously, you don't have to go through the same experience again, but things that you know, if ever you had to go through it again, you know now.
Absolutely. And it's the things that people like us, John, who don't come from legal backgrounds.
Exactly.
That's where we miss out because we don't have that advice and that knowledge.
Yeah.
Which I suspect is why we both do things like this to try and spread it as much as possible.
Precisely. You've hit the nail on the head. This is why I do things like this, because I didn't come from that sort of background, didn't have any connections in the law whatsoever. And I find that when I run, you know, these events and what have you, I'm always getting, you know, quite simple questions, but things that I would have asked when I was a student or I wouldn't have known. So I'm always glad that, you know, people like yourself and I have made these mistakes and we can, you know, sort of pass on the wisdom, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so obviously it's the Speed Mooting podcast, and you've judged at a few of our competitions in the past. So have you got any tips for people who enter either mooting competitions or other forms of advocacy competitions?
I've got two main tips. There are loads. You can do whole workshops on it, as you know. But one is try and move away from the script. And there are different ways that you can do that. I use colour, and I got the mickey taken out of me at bar school for it, because I'd have my notes and they would be massive, you know, like size 18, 20 font, bullet points, and each topic was in a different colour. Whether that be cross-examination or a closing speech or submissions in a moot, whatever it was. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that helped it stick in my mind more. I don't have a photographic memory or anything, but I picture a page when I'm thinking about it. When I learn lines for my AmDram, I can picture where on the page I am, which helps me stay on track. And I do a similar thing with my notes, and I still do it. I will still colour my notes because it makes it easier. What that also does is enables you to deal with judicial intervention, which is often where you get additional points in competitions. If you've got people who are of very similar high caliber and you're trying to tell the difference, as a judge, I will give them a really hard time. I often say to people, you don't need to worry if I'm intervening, you need to worry if I'm not, because I'm not going to make someone's moot go worse by causing them a problem. But if they are so high, and I'm like, yeah, I want to push this person, you know, I really want to push them and see where they can get to, then I will intervene a lot more. And some say I'm relatively harsh when I intervene, but there we are. And what having the colours helps with is if as an intervention they say, well, I don't want to talk about that right now, I want to talk about this other thing. I know that that other thing is red. So I can go straight to the red section of my notes and I can answer the question. And when they inevitably say, fine, carry on, or go, what were you saying before? I've remembered I was in the green section. So I can turn straight back and go straight back to my green section. And I'm not having to try and keep my finger on it or try and answer a question I wasn't expecting whilst thinking about where was I and where am I going to pick this up from again. So that is helpful, but that's helpful for me. That's not necessarily helpful for everyone. The point is you need to develop your own system that isn't a script, because scripts make it artificial. It makes it not enough of a conversation. It actually can make it more stunted, because if you lose your place, you've got nowhere to go with it. Yeah. A lot of people start with a script and then they come off a script, and what they'll find is their advocacy drops, the quality of it, and that is absolutely fine, because when it goes back up, it will go up higher. So it's fine to do that. The second point is know your case like you know your own life. If I'm talking to someone about their day, and I'm like, tell me, and I do it if I'm doing a workshop, and it is actually something I stole from someone else because I thought it was brilliant. But it's if I ask you about your day, you can tell me I got up at about this time, you know, I had this for breakfast, I brushed my teeth, and then I say, okay, but how did you get to work? You don't have to think about it. You can say, oh, well, I caught the train. Why did you catch the train? Well, because I knew the traffic was going to be bad, so I didn't want to drive. Okay, can you just remind me, what did you have for breakfast? And you can immediately say it because you know it so well. The ideal position is that you know your case that well, and you can answer the questions as you would if someone was simply asking about your day. In reality, in practice, you're very rarely going to be able to get to grips with a case that isn't a full trial that in that detail, because you don't get the papers in enough time. Nothing else. Yeah. You just don't get them in enough time. When I'm as a pupil supervisor or mentoring or whatever, ideally I'd read papers 3 times. I'd read them once without making any notes. I'd read them the second time and make notes, and I'd read them the third time to make sure I hadn't missed anything out. Unless it's a full trial, I don't have time to do that. Yeah. There's just not time. But that would be ideal. So where you're doing competitions and you do have that time, then do that. And of course, I think, John, with your competitions, do you give out the case, but they don't know which side they're going to be on?
Yeah, so for the moots, we send out the problem and they have to prepare for both sides, the appellant and the respondent. And so what will happen is throughout the day, they'll act for both sides. So in round 1, they might be for the appellant, round 2 for the respondent, and it'll vary throughout the day.
And that's brilliant, because when I'm prepping a case, I don't prep it from my client's point of view. I prep it from the other side's point of view, because I need to anticipate what they're going to say as much as anything. Obviously, I do prep it for my client, but
No,
in my mind, I'm thinking, well, what's the other side going to say about this point? And what's the judge going to be thinking about this point? Which is a little bit easier now I sit as a judge. It's been very helpful. So it's so important to look at it from the other side's point of view, and I would actually put more emphasis on that than anything else. So the fact that your competitions and moots are set up that way is ideal, because it gets them into that
Yeah,
into
I'm glad you've
that
said
way.
that, because that's the advice I give when it comes to preparing for judicial intervention. You know, if you've got to read both sides of the case when you're going through the appellant side, and let's say you're preparing it, well, you've already thought about the case from the respondent's point of view. So you're thinking about what their point is on that. So you know, A, what they're going to say, so how you can rebut that, but also you know where the weaknesses are in your case and where the questions are likely to come from JI. So yeah, that's a perfect way to deal with the case. So I'm glad you made
Yeah,
that point.
yeah, the ability to deal with difficult questions is far superior than your um, delivery of prepared submissions. If we're intervening on a difficult point and you deal with it and you've clearly thought about it in advance, that's the indication that you're a good advocate.
Yeah, completely. Right. Well, that's the most of the main part of the interview done. So we're going to move on to the fun part now, the the quick fire round. So
Yeah.
just some sort of fun questions towards the end. You should have some interesting answers for some of these, because obviously I know that you're into your amateur dramatics. So
Yes, I
what
am.
would be your favorite film?
I'm so mood based. It's
Right.
really, really dependent. Um, so film wise, be my go-to. Gosh, it was always 10 Things I Hate About You when I was younger. And I think of as a kind of, what do I want to curl up on the sofa with a cup of tea and a duvet? Um, 10 Things I Hate About You would still be quite high up there. But the Marvel films, I mean, pretty much all of them. Black Panther is my favorite of the Marvel films. But if I'm in a more of an actiony mood, then probably Black Panther or one of the other Marvel ones.
Okay, brilliant. Do you watch much theatre at all?
Yes, I as much as I can. What I found is really brilliant is the live streaming to cinemas.
Oh,
So if you don't have a lot of time, and it is cheaper as well, it's more expensive than going to the cinema normally, but it's not as expensive as going to the theatre.
yeah.
Uh, so where I am, I'm quite close to Milton Keynes Theatre, so I try and go with my mum as regularly as I can to that. Uh, but we do go to the cinema one. So we're going on Saturday to see Good, which has David Tennant in it.
Oh, great.
And then most recently, actually, I've been going to see the ballets with my ballet group, essentially, who I do dance lessons with, and that's really good as well, because the ballet is, there's not as much of it about, and it can be very expensive. So having the opportunity to go and see that live streamed is really good as well.
Yeah. Oh, sounds fantastic. So what would be your top thing to see then?
From
Either
a
on the
theatre
live
point of
stream,
view,
yeah, from the theatre point of view.
if it's musicals, my favourite musical is Miss Saigon. Les Mis obviously is an epic thing to go and see, and everyone should see it. But Miss Saigon is my favourite, both because it's sentimental to me, but also I just think the storyline is so excellent. And I've never seen it in the West End, but I did see it in Milton Keynes. But they do in the West End. They have an actual helicopter. It's all about
Wow.
Vietnam, and they have an actual helicopter, which they didn't have when I was in Milton Keynes. And we were all sitting there going, "How are they going to do it? It'll be really interesting." So those are my favourite. Neither of those particularly happy musicals. And from a play point of view, probably an Inspector Calls, which is just great. I studied it and saw it when I was at school, and then it was on recently again in Milton Keynes, and I went with my family, and I just remembered it so vividly, and I was like, oh yeah, this is incredible. And actually what was really lovely is that it was full of school kids, because it's still on the syllabus, so
Oh,
there'd
wow.
been loads of school trips, and I was thinking they're probably sort of 14, 15. And actually what became quite apparent was it was a lot of their first trips to the theatre,
Mm.
um, because of course they've been stuck indoors, and even if they would have been theatre goers, they hadn't had the opportunity, because we went quite soon after lockdown lifted. And when we arrived, there was a lot of grumpy teenagers going, "Can't believe I've got to spend my Wednesday night at the theatre. Oh, can't believe I'm having to do this." And then in the interval, it was like, this is amazing. Like, did you see this bit? And did you see that bit? And as someone who's loved the theatre for her whole life, it was so brilliant. And there's a bit where there's like an affair, and then he gets found out, and she slaps him, and there's a decanter of I don't know if it's whiskey, but they have what looks like a bottle, and as someone who's experienced, I was looking at it going, that's going to be smashed on someone's head. Like, that's definitely the way they do it. That's definitely a prop. But it looks like real glass. So this thing goes, and the whole audience just erupts with, oh my God, what? And when she slaps him, they all cheer. And it was so lovely. The power of the theatre is amazing. And it's for everyone. It's like the bar. It's for everyone. There's this thought that it's only for a select few, but it's not. It's for everyone.
Absolutely. I mean, I've not been often. I've been to see a few things recently. The most recent thing was at Mrs. Doubtfire. That was fun.
Oh, I really want to go and see it. Is it good?
It's brilliant.
Yeah, it's on my list. It's on my list.
Excellent. Yeah, it's excellent. Right, only a few more questions to go. The last two are quite linked. Favorite food?
Food or meal?
Either or. It's open to interpretation.
I'm a total chocoholic.
Okay.
So that's where I are. But I'm very regimented in a lot of things I do. So at home, I would want bubble and squeak. People make it differently. It's mashed potato and Brussels sprouts. I don't put carrots in it. I don't do anything. If I want carrots, they're at the side, with some fried eggs, and then probably some sausages. That's a good kind of hearty, because I'm a country gal. That's if I go out, gammon and eggs, Caesar salad, and chunky chips. Not together. Those are the meals that I have.
I see. Nice and simple.
Okay. Yeah, it actually is. I like knowing what's going to happen.
No, I'm not here to judge. Not here to judge at all. Although you will be on the last question. So as a judge, actually, it'll be good to get your opinion on this. And this is a question I ask to all of my guests, so it's quite important, this one. Crisps on a sandwich, do they belong there?
I don't eat crisps. I don't like the texture. But I have very fond memories of crisp sandwiches, not from my own point of view, but my brother and my nephew, who I'm very close with, absolutely loves a crisp sandwich. So for the family honour, I would say yes, John, crisps in a sandwich, absolutely fine.
Brilliant. That's another tick in favour of the normal people. We've maintained our lead.
Excellent.
Brilliant. All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to appear on the podcast tonight. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I'm sure our guests have learnt a lot from listening to your advice tonight. So thank you very much for appearing on the podcast.
Thanks, John. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.